I'm a pretty big fan of Pac-Man, if you couldn't tell. Ever since I was a kid, I've really enjoyed the franchise. It's been very special to me. And today, May 22nd, 2020, is the 40th anniversary of Pac-Man's release. To celebrate the birthday of one of my all-time favorite video game franchises, I'm going to take a look back at what made the original arcade classic so special. To say that Pac-Man was a massive success when it first hit arcades in 1980 would be an understatement. You could argue this game single-handedly made gaming a mainstream hobby. Sure, there had been successes prior, like Space Invaders and Pong, but Pac-Man brought people into arcades by the millions to throw quarters into machines like it was nothing. It made over $2.5 billion, equaling over $7 billion in today's money. Keep in mind that Pac-Man managed this at a time where arcade gaming was in its infancy, and was still looked down on by many people as a geek's hobby. So why? Why did Pac-Man, of all things, do so incredibly well? Let's take a deep dive into how the game works to see what made it a success. To start off, I gotta say, I really love the game's visual style. The sprites are simplistic, yet still have a certain charm to them. The neon blue outlined walls of the maze give it a kind of futuristic look that's really nice on the eyes. This aesthetic would be a staple of the series moving forward, and that really shows how well they nailed the visual design on their first try here. I love how the ghosts' different colors all align with their personalities so well, with Clyde's red hue representing his brashness as he chases straight for Pac-Man, Pinky's pink color, matching her more distant tactics of trying to think ahead and catch Pac-Man off from in front. Inky's light blue hue representing his more aloof nature as he takes an erratic, somewhat random path to catch the player off guard, and Clyde's vivid orange color matching his shyness as he tends to run away from Pac-Man if he gets too close. Pac-Man's bright shade of yellow makes him really stick out, and that iconic design of a pizza with a slice missing really makes the most of his simple design. He chomps away at the dots as he moves and unfolds backwards, similarly to a folding fan being closed whenever he gets caught by a ghost. I love the little frightened look on the ghosts' faces when you eat a power pellet. It conveys really well to the player that you have the advantage, and what were once your insta-kill predators are now vulnerable to your attack. Likewise, their flashing between white and blue signifies a return to their normal state very intuitively. This may seem like obvious common sense game design in action, but keep in mind this game came out in 1980, well before these typical ideas were so common. Pac-Man really set the standard in conveying information to the player just through its visual design alone, and that is really impressive. Granted, there is somewhat of a tutorial on the intro screen, but it's still impressive that this game manages to convey so much important information without a single word. I also love the little cutscenes that play every few levels. There are 3 of these intermissions, each one playing after completing levels 2, 5, and 9. They all feature Pac-Man and Blinky chasing each other around with some light slapstick. I especially love how the second cutscene features Blinky getting caught on a line of white pixels, and a piece of his coat rips off. I guess this is technically his skin. Kinda fucked up if you think about it that way. Anyway, what I love is how the third intermission follows this up with Blinky running on screen with his missing piece stapled back on. Yeah, they aren't anything crazy, but the cutscenes add a small bit of charm and character to the game, as well as giving the player a short breather from the action. In fact, the piece of music that plays during the cutscenes is titled Coffee Break, as that's exactly what the intermissions are intended to be. I've always wished there was a way to skip it though, since I end up seeing the first cutscene over and over and over again, and it gets pretty repetitive. To this day, I have never played any port of Pac-Man that features these cutscenes and gives you an option to skip them or turn them off. Maybe one exists, but if it does, I've never played it. The sound design is likewise very memorable and charming. The coffee break piece I mentioned before is the only real piece of music in the whole game. The actual gameplay is just filled with sound effects. Coffee Break is a pretty great little jingle though. It always gets stuck in my head. The bouncy bass complements the energetic main melody really well. For such a short piece, it's really effective at getting you pumped up and ready for the next round. As for the sound effects, they're incredible. Pac-Man has probably the best sound design of any arcade game I've ever played. The classic waka waka of Pac-Man eating dots, that crunchy chomp sound when you catch a ghost, the ding 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 of getting an extra life, it's all so satisfying. Perfect for keeping the player motivated to chase high scores. This is well complemented by the intensity of the sound of ghosts chasing you down. Running through the maze with ghosts hot on your trail as the sound gets faster and faster as you eat more dots, it can really get your blood pumping. That death sound effect too, it's just iconic. I'm trying to avoid giving aspects of this game too much praise for just being iconic, because that seems like a lousy way of explaining why I think it's good, but when you walk into an arcade and have to decide what to give your quarters to, sound effects are everything. In fact, most arcade games had an attract mode that would spew out sound effects to, well, attract players to the cabinets. The sound design has to be recognizable and interesting to someone who's never seen the game before, and satisfying to returning players. Pac-Man absolutely nails this. If there's one sound effect I think is a bit lacking, it's the sound that plays when you eat a fruit. There's no pause like when you eat a ghost, so it lacks that physical oomph, but the sound that plays is way too low-pitched and quiet. You can barely hear it over the sound of the ghosts chasing you. With that one minor nitpick aside though, the sound design and overall presentation of Pac-Man is excellent. But enough of that. Let's get into the gameplay and see what makes Pac-Man tick. There are two core elements of arcade Pac-Man design that, when perfected, come together to make an exciting and addicting game. These are enemy AI and maze design. They facilitate each other in ways that make for a fun experience, so I'm going to break them down and analyze their qualities and their faults. I'll start with the enemy AI. To start things off, I'm going to lay out the three main rules that make up the core of any good Pac-Man game's AI. Rule number 1. No two ghosts have the same AI. Each ghost must track Pac-Man down in a different way for the game to be challenging and engaging. Rule number 2. All ghosts must be in the same state at the same time. This allows observant players to keep track of the ghost's current state and predict AI better, allowing for a higher skill ceiling. Rule number 3. No ghost may ever make a 180-degree turn and suddenly run back in the opposite direction. This gives the player some breathing room when following behind a ghost and keeps the ghost from just going wherever they want. Now, I know what some of you may be thinking, but ahbeef, all three of those rules are broken in some way, and yeah, you're right, there are exceptions to these rules, but in a general sense, the AI will follow these rules in order to keep the gameplay balanced. I'll get more into what those exceptions are and whether or not I consider them to be acceptable exceptions a little bit later, but for now, I'm just going to focus on how the individual ghosts' AIs work. Now, I'm not going to go into a super detailed breakdown here. I'll leave links in the description to some videos that do a much better job than I could here without just copying from them, but I will do my best to paraphrase and get the important information to you in an easily understandable way. I'll start with the different modes in which the ghosts act. At any given time, each ghost is in one of 4 modes: Chase, Scatter, Frightened, and Eaten. Chase and Scatter are the modes in which ghosts attempt to capture Pac-Man. Frightened is when the ghosts turn to blue after Pac-Man eats a power pellet, and Eaten sees the ghosts return to its cage after being eaten by Pac-Man. Frightened and Eaten are both very straightforward. Pac-Man gets a power pellet, ghosts become frightened, turn backwards, one of the rule exceptions I mentioned earlier, and will wander around in random directions until they either return to normal or are eaten. Eaten ghosts will become intangible and follow a direct path from where they were eaten to the ghost cage, where they will exit again and return to their normal state. Scatter and Chase modes are a bit more complicated. Scatter mode sees each ghost heading to a designated corner where they wander in a predetermined path until they enter Chase mode. Blinky goes to the top right corner, Pinky goes to the top left corner, Inky goes to the bottom right corner, and Clyde goes to the bottom left corner. After a set amount of time, which gets shorter as you get farther into the game, the ghosts enter Chase mode, where they turn around 180 degrees, the other exception to that rule, and hunt Pac-Man down. The way in which each ghost tries to trap Pac-Man differs slightly, creating a very complex game of cat and mouse. There's a universal pathing algorithm that all ghosts follow to get to their target tiles. I won't break down the whole algorithm here, but it basically ensures that the ghosts take the most efficient route to their target tile without breaking the previously established rules. For every tile that the ghosts move, their target tile updates, and the tiles that each ghost targets are what separates them so distinctly. I alluded to their behaviors earlier, but I'll break them down in more depth here. Blinky aims directly for whichever tile Pac-Man is on, making him pretty easy to predict by himself. He'll pretty much always be right on your tail. On his own, he's not much of a threat, but the synergy he has with the other ghosts is what makes them so dangerous. Pinky's target aims 4 tiles in front of whatever direction Pac-Man is currently facing. She can be pretty hard to predict, as you're always moving in different directions, causing Pinky to kinda run all over the place. There is a small caveat to Pinky's AI though. Due to a bug in the code, when Pac-Man is facing up, Pinky's target tile aims 4 tiles above Pac-Man and 3 tiles to the left. This small bug makes Pinky much easier to manipulate than the other ghosts, especially in vertical shafts. Generally though, you can expect Pinky to try and cut you off from ahead, sandwiching you between her and Clyde.
What are you? An idiot sandwich.
Inky has the most complicated algorithm for determining what tile to target. Similarly to Pinky, he picks a point 2 tiles in front of whatever direction Pac-Man is facing, creates a line from that point towards Blinky, and rotates that line 180 degrees about the initial point to get the target tile. Side note, when picking the initial point, the same bug Pinky has also affects Inky, causing the point to land 2 tiles up and 2 tiles to the left when Pac-Man is facing upwards, though this doesn't affect Inky nearly as much because his targeting system is much more complicated. This complex method of targeting allows Inky to catch up to Pac-Man very quickly when far away, and typically traps you from the front or side, working very well with both Blinky and Pinky. Finally, we have Clyde. He's a bit of a special case, as he normally will target Pac-Man's tile directly, just like Blinky, but when he enters the 7-tile radius of Pac-Man, he will change his target tile to the bottom left corner of the screen. This means that Clyde is usually not much of a threat outside of a few certain situations, like when you're in the bottom left section of the maze. Having one of the ghosts only pose a mild threat in comparison to the others is pretty brilliant, as it allows for what appears to be extra tension while not actually putting too much pressure on the player. This is just a small part of the excellent balance that the enemy AI has. When traveling through a maze, the player has a lot to consider: the shape of the maze ahead of them, the locations of all 4 ghosts, the nearest power pellet and whether or not they can safely get to it, how many dots they can grab without getting too greedy, while also not leaving too much of a mess to have to clean up later, and of course, which mode the ghosts are in and where they might be headed. Being able to see when they switch modes by their 180-degree turn that occurs when it happens, an otherwise impossible occurrence, gives the player an advantage, as they can prepare for the incoming onslaught and head to a more advantageous position. Or if you catch them switching to scatter mode, you can safely go into more dangerous areas without fear of getting caught. In addition, there are 2 areas where the ghosts are not allowed to turn upwards, so if you get chased from below, they make good escape routes to give yourself some breathing room. The bottom right corner here can even be exploited in some situations to get all the ghosts stuck in an infinite loop while you decide what to do next. It won't always work, but if you know how to bend the game to your will, you kinda can, and that allows for a very high skill ceiling. That is kind of a problem for arcade games, since you can walk into an arcade hoping to play a specific game and see one guy on the only cabinet of it on stage 74 and realize you're not getting to play anytime soon. But in terms of making a fun and well-balanced game, it gets a thumbs up from me. Before, I mentioned the cat and mouse dynamic of Pac-Man and the enemy ghosts, and this is the main appeal of Pac-Man's gameplay. The intensity of being chased down from all sides by a group of ghosts with identifiable yet still somewhat unpredictable behavior is what makes clearing levels so satisfying. When you finally get to that power pellet with all 4 ghosts on your tail only to turn back and chomp them all up, it's a rush that no other arcade game at the time could have dreamed of giving you. Sure, you can just run through and grab the pellets as you go, prioritizing progress over score, but that gets a bit boring after a while. In fact, I used to play the game like this a lot, rushing through each stage, and now that I force myself to play more patiently, trying for a higher score rather than the farthest stage, I've come to enjoy the game a lot more. Pac-Man emphasizes a riskier playstyle, rewarding you with more points for getting higher combos on ghosts with a single power pellet. To get this, you'll have to carefully lure all the ghosts to one corner of the map, which becomes harder and harder the longer the stage goes on, since they'll be in chase mode for longer. The payoff is huge though, giving you a total of 3,000 points just from grabbing the ghosts. This puts you at more of a risk though, as the ghosts will head back to their cage and return to normal faster the sooner that you eat them. It's a slight difference, but every second counts when you're trying to maximize score and efficiency. You want a quick point bonus? Try to grab one of those fruits. If the ghosts are in scatter mode, it'll drain your timer for it when you could be using that time to clear the dots and reduce cleanup at the end of the level, or if the ghosts are in chase mode, it'll make it really hard to get there before the fruit despawns. Pac-Man is all about calculating risk to maximize your score, and making those quick decisions on the fly while paying attention to every little detail of the ghost's movement and maze layout and your position and mode changes. It drives the intensity, thereby increasing the satisfaction of grabbing all 4 ghosts at once, or sneaking in to grab the bonus fruit, or clearing a whole maze without dying. Every element comes together for one of the most fun arcade experiences ever made. Before I move on from this though, I have to mention the exceptions to the rules that I listed earlier. Rule number 1 states that no 2 ghosts have the same AI, and while this is true for scatter and chase mode, there is no difference between the ghost pathing or movement AI. That only seems fair though, as the ghosts would be way too unpredictable if they not only targeted Pac-Man but also moved in completely different ways. On top of that, while in eaten mode, they're completely intangible, and having separate movement AI wouldn't make a difference, and in frightened mode, their movements are randomized, so it creates the illusion that the ghosts all move in different ways even in this mode. These, in my opinion, are acceptable exceptions to the rule. Rule number 2 states that all ghosts must be in the same state at the same time, and while this is generally true, when you eat a ghost it will switch to eaten mode, regardless of the rest of the ghost states, return to its cage, and go back to either scatter or chase mode, again disregarding any other ghost states. This only makes sense, seeing as you only ate the one ghost, and having it come back to threaten your safety while you track down the others adds some challenge. Things go right back to normal once all the ghosts leave their frightened or eaten states though. The other exception to this rule is Blinky. He actually will remain in chase mode when the rest of the ghosts enter scatter mode if there are less than a certain number of dots on the screen remaining. This number increases as the game goes on, adding a small difficulty curve. This is a fair exception to the rule, as Blinky is the leader of the group and his chase mode AI is bent on following Pac-Man directly, so it falls in line with his personality to hunt him down regardless of what the other ghosts are doing when he's running out of time. This is the exception I'm least fond of, as it's not the most intuitive, but it hardly ever results in what seems to be unfair moments, as by the time you get to the last however many dots, the ghosts have likely entered permanent chase mode for the rest of the level anyway. Rule number 3 states that the ghosts may never turn around, and yes, while in any given state they will never turn around, they only make a 180-degree turn when switching between scatter and chase mode or when entering frightened mode. This is once again an acceptable exception to the rule, as it only makes sense for them to run away from Pac-Man after chasing him once he grabs a power pellet, and using a 180-degree turn to signify the mode switch allows observant players to take advantage of the information and play smarter. It can lead to some bullshit deaths, but it's much more likely to be used to the player's advantage than disadvantage, especially since scatter mode sends each ghost to the corner of the map, where Pac-Man can easily avoid them until they switch modes again. While the rules are broken in specific situations, it's mostly down to technicalities or other small details that are perfectly acceptable. It's not like the ghosts are doing random different things at different times or just turning around 180 whenever the hell they want to fuck you over. The game is still well balanced, and these exceptions usually further that balance and keep the game from getting boring or repetitive. So the AI is wonderfully crafted, despite a few teeny tiny issues, and complement the game flow very well. But that would all fall apart if the design of the maze didn't facilitate this frantic gameplay and quick decision making. Now it's time to break down what makes for a well-designed Pac-Man maze. To start off, the ghosts are not allowed to turn upwards in these two corridors, right above their ghost cage and right above where Pac-Man starts in the maze. I mentioned this earlier, but I'm going to mark them off here as relatively safe zones. They're good escape routes when being chased. Notice how they're still very small and only offer one reliable escape route in each quadrant of the maze, meaning you can't choose the safe zones as a get-out-of-jail-free card, except for the infinite loop where you sit in the bottom right corner, but that's still very situational and isn't used very often in high-level gameplay. Next, check out the sides. There are a lot of different exits and entrances on either side, including the tunnels. These are transition areas, allowing you to travel from one quadrant of the maze to the other, while being relatively safe. It's worth keeping in mind that if you're being chased by ghosts, their speed is slightly higher than Pac-Man's, and they will catch up to you if you run in a straight line. Tunnels make for a good escape, but they're a bit of a gray area. See, if a ghost goes through a tunnel, its speed is reduced while transitioning from one side of the screen to the other, whereas Pac-Man's isn't. This prevents you from getting blindsided if you run into a tunnel where the ghost is coming at you. However, you can easily get sandwiched if you're chased into a tunnel and have another ghost waiting for you on the other end, so while they make for good escape routes, you still have to be careful here. Next are these intermediate areas. They're in the middle of all the other areas and feature many twists and turns, so you can get some distance from the ghosts if you're being chased through them. Notice again how there's one in each quadrant and they're not too big. They give you a slight advantage, but not so much that you can abuse them. Finally, the corners. These are the high danger zones. The ghosts will automatically head to these areas when in scatter mode, and when being chased you have few options to escape, since there's flat walls on two sides of any given corner, especially on the bottom side where you have long tunnels with nowhere to turn out. These are the most dangerous parts of the entire maze, as your escape options are very limited and you're forced down a long straight path, giving the ghosts ample time to catch up to you or surround you. Now take a look at which section the power pellets are in. That's right, they're in the danger zones. Trust me, this was no accident. Putting the only thing that gives you the upper hand over the ghosts in the most dangerous area to traverse makes it much riskier, and therefore much more satisfying when you pull it off. You can get them done early, getting the hardest parts of the maze done with little to no fight, but there won't be many ghosts around for you to eat all at once, reducing your score. Waiting too long to get the power pellets, however, can lead to Pac-Man being forced into the most dangerous parts of the maze with ghosts ready to trap you if you're not careful. This amplifies the risk-reward aspect. The placement of the power pellets in Pac-Man's maze is very smart. So that covers the maze design, as there is only this one maze. Once you clear a stage, you're right back at the start. I'll get more into progression a little later, but for now, wow, this maze is really well designed. I mean, look how it starts you on the bottom half of the screen, pointing towards Clyde's corner, who is the last ghost to come out of the cage, giving you ample time to clean up some of the hardest parts of the map. Likewise, the ghost cage is smartly placed at the top middle of the screen, mirroring Pac-Man's starting position. Safer areas flow into more dangerous areas and vice versa. There's plenty of curves and openings that lead to multiple different paths, and the most important items are held for the most dangerous sections. And it all complements both Pac-Man's movement and the Ghost's AI very well. These elements flow together beautifully to create an addictive, intense, and satisfying game. It's no wonder that so many people flocked into arcades to play this back in 1980 with its fun mechanics, tight design, brilliant AI, colorful charming graphics, and memorable sound design. Pac-Man is nothing short of an arcade masterpiece, but it has one fatal flaw that holds it back. Like I said, there's only one maze. Yes, that maze is brilliantly designed, but it's still only one level. Imagine if Sonic the Hedgehog looped Green Hell Zone Act 1 over and over for eternity. Sure, it's fun, and while the loops get harder and harder with a tight difficulty curve, it will eventually get stale. Imagine playing a perfect game of Pac-Man. You've grinded through the first 20 mazes, memorized the movement for the rest, and then you have to just play the next 240 of them on autopilot, doing the same exact movement over and over and over. I can't attest to that experience personally, but it doesn't really look like something I would ever want to do. It seems so tedious and boring. Once you've reached the skill ceiling, there's not much variety to keep you invested for long play sessions. This is really only a problem that hinders the most dedicated players who probably aren't bothered by it anyway, but I'd imagine that after a long enough period of time, you'd just get bored of Pac-Man, doing the same maze over and over. This isn't a deal breaker, as the core gameplay loop is still fun, but it'll only last you so many hours, or in arcade terms, so many quarters. Once you stop putting quarters in a machine, that game has failed as an arcade game. Now I know I kinda made the opposite complaint back in my review of Flicky, where I said the difficulty spike makes for a bad home console experience when you're trying to see every level of the game. However, the issue wasn't in the game having too many unique levels, it was in its poor difficulty balancing. Pac-Man doesn't have that issue, so again, the lack of variety isn't a deal breaker, but it does mean that Pac-Man has a limited staying power. The difficulty curve though, like I said, is definitely not an issue. It's really well done in fact. As the levels go on, the timer for power pellets gets shorter and shorter until they eventually stop working entirely, and just make the ghosts turn around and continue their normal behavior. On top of that, for every stage that you beat, the scatter mode timer gets shorter and the chase mode timer gets longer. Similarly, the amount of dots remaining required for Blinky to enter permanent chase mode will increase as you progress. It can get pretty difficult pretty early on, but the difficulty curve is at least consistent and smooth, rather than spiking upwards. In fact, it spikes back down a little bit a couple of times throughout the first 20 or so levels to give the player a little bit of a breather, which is appreciated. The game speed also slightly increases, both throughout each individual maze as you collect dots, as well as the base game speed as you beat more and more levels. It has a really nice difficulty curve that makes the game super intense and challenging, while almost never being unfair or frustrating. That said, there are a few minor issues I have that could have been ironed out a little better. For example, you can very easily pass right through the side of a ghost when they're in frightened mode and not eat them if they're passing through an intersection. This often throws me off and has even gotten me killed a couple of times, though this does have the reverse effect of allowing Pac-Man to pass right through a ghost when it's chasing you. This is much less common though, as it is a one-frame, pixel-perfect window. It's a minor nitpick, but still pretty annoying. Second, the timer on the bonus fruit seems way too short at times. I'll see a fruit spawn, try to head towards it, but can't get in there because there are ghosts in the way, so I go around in circles trying to get in, and before I can get close to it, it's already gone. This isn't always the case, but sometimes it just feels impossible to get them at all if you're unlucky. Again, this is a minor issue, but could have been easily fixed by increasing the timer by just a few more seconds. Pac-Man is something of an anomaly. Namco knocked it out of the park on their first attempt, when gaming was in its infancy and common sense design was not yet common. It led the path forward for arcade gaming and gaming as a whole, and brought millions into arcades to popularize and legitimize the hobby. It managed all of this 40 years ago, and analyzing its mechanics closely like this has given me so much more appreciation for it. I find myself surprised at just how well designed this game was for its time. But of course, Pac-Man wasn't just an arcade hit. No, Pac-Man made its way into the houses of millions too, with its countless ports, remakes, collections, and plug-and-plays. Seriously, if I were to go over each and every one of them, I'd be here all day. It took a little while for console gaming to catch up with arcade hardware, so we didn't really get a faithful port until the PlayStation era. Previous home console ports always had limited graphics, ran slower, didn't sound as good, or all three in the case of the infamous Atari 2600 port, among other early home computer ports. Nowadays, you can get this game on pretty much anything and it'll run perfectly, but before around 2005, your options were limited. Take the 2002 PC remake for example, Namco All-Stars Pac-Man. It features botched looping sound effects, stats that don't do anything, and an enhanced mode that just adds a neon gradient on the maze walls and a horrible echo and even worse looping on sound effects than the classic mode. This is a truly terrible port, and it's no wonder it was essentially lost to time. Well, that and the fact that it was a digital-only PC game in the early 2000s. Then there's the modern mobile version, which has the classic mode with some pretty janky touch controls, and a new mode with a multitude of brand new stages, with forced-in microtransactions and in-game currency. The new challenge mazes aren't anything special, so there's nothing really here worth your time. I'm not a big fan of this version. There's the co-op World's Largest Pac-Man, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a pretty fun experience to play with a friend if you ever see a machine out in the wild at a Dave & Buster's or something. There's Pac-Man Doodle, the playable Pac-Man maze in the shape of the Google logo made to celebrate Pac-Man's 30th anniversary on the Google homepage, and boy does this not facilitate Pac-Man's gameplay mechanics at all. This is just a really bad layout for a Pac-Man maze, but it is a cute novelty. Then there's Pac-Man 256, which is quite literally just an official ROM hack of Pac-Man that starts you on the infamous kill screen. Pac-Man Plus is another glorified ROM hack that will get its own video a little later. And of course, there's the plethora of collections, plug-and-plays, and Namco museums that all have the obligatory Pac-Man included. I think you get the point here. Pac-Man has been remixed, remade, and re-released too many times to count, and if you want a good version of it to play now, you're far from needing an arcade cabinet in your home. Hell, the Namco Museum Arcade Pack, which I used to get the footage for this video, is a pretty much perfect port with its own additional challenge mode that has you eat as many ghosts as possible under a 3-minute time limit, with bonus points being awarded for ghost combos. I could go on and on and on about the different ports, but again, I don't want to be here all day. This video is already long enough for a review of just Pac-Man. With all that said, I've pretty much said everything I can about Pac-Man, but his story doesn't end there. No, we've got a long way to go in covering the history of this franchise, so next up, after I finish the Danganronpa video, I'll be looking at Midway's highly successful sequel, Miss Pac-Man. Don't forget to like and subscribe and all that shit, support me on Patreon, thank you to my patrons right here on the screen, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.